Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart, let them be found pleasing and acceptable in your sight, God, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. If it is not on my manuscript, I ask that you place it in my mouth so that these your people are able to hear a word from you. In Christ's name we pray, amen. For this morning's sermon text and title, I want to talk to you all this morning about an unreliable witness. An unreliable witness. Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby, Nellie in Wuthering Heights, even the demon in the Screwtape Letters. These are all examples of the literature and film motif of an unreliable narrator. The hallmark of an unreliable narrator was classified in 1981 by William Riggins, and he suggested the following telltale signs. One, the narrators declare anti-hero of the story. They function as the jester or the clown, or they are the madman or the madwoman that functions pathologically, or they are the naive. We want someone who is quite naive, so much so that their grasp of the situation or judgment ought to be called into question. If you recall, Holden Caulfield's grasp on reality is called into question by the end of the book, even though he starts out, I think the first page starts out by acknowledging that he's one of the best liars you've ever met. Nick Carraway's naivete allows him to reserve judgment about who Jay Gatsby is, let alone the philandering, racist, and murderous nature of his cousin's husband, Tom Buchanan. Nellie's naivete alters her view of the life around her. And well, can any of us trust a demon who is writing letters? The unknown author of the book of Luke opens the narrative with a definitive stance. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, as one having a grasp on everything from the start, to write a well-ordered account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have a firm grasp of the words in which you have been instructed. That was all one sentence. That was a lot. They didn't decide to break it up. It was one sentence, felt like a run-on sentence, but here we are, 2,000 years later. And this one sentence, suggests, I know that you've heard one thing, but come here. Let me tell you what actually happened. The Lucan writer launches into what may seem like a fantastic story, a story of angels descending and appearing, a story of a miracle birth, and then even a man whose voice is cut off and made mute and can no longer speak. William Riggins argues that some of the telltale signs of an unreliable narrator is that the story seems too fantastic to be plausible. There are gaps in the facts and contradictions. So I think maybe the stories of angels descending and making people mute might fall into that category. However, in the reading of this morning's passage, I find myself drawn to the use of the word narrative and eyewitnesses. The occurrence of those two words only appear once in the entirety of the New Testament in their Greek form, which of course makes me wonder, whose account are we really reading? Luke the disciple? A follower of Luke? Is this actually Zechariah's account? Or is there something more? Now, if anything, I think maybe we all can agree, scholars agree, I agree, I think anybody that does their own independent research would agree that the narrator does start at a place of an incontrovertible fact. In the days of King Herod of Judea. This was a fact then, it's still a fact now. Every ounce of history has confirmed this fact. This mark of ancient writings still holds today. It is not an uncommon occurrence that many of us mark a moment in history by acknowledging who was in control of the government. The Throughout the ancient Hebrew scriptures, many superscripts to the Tanakh began with noting who was king. In the vicious passage of the death and murder of the Levite's concubine, the chapter opens up, "There was no king in Israel." Similarly, Isaiah sees God high and lifted up in what? In the year that King Uzziah died. And this narrator, the same narrator of Luke, also wrote the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, there's dripping political drama in the mid and later chapters of Acts as Paul is dragged before kangaroo courts. And we get the names of all of the tetrarchs and the petrarchs. And even Herod's grandson, the same Herod of Judea, Herod's grandson, Herod Agrippa, was noted to be eaten by the worms as he falls dead in Acts chapter 12 for not giving God praise. In other words, this Lucan writer, this unreliable narrator, wanted it to be made known from the beginning that times were rough and that the yearnings for a better day and a new day had grown weary. The Jews at the time had suffered under the tyranny of the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, and now the Roman government. They were only a few generations removed from the Maccabean revolt, a rebellion in the 2nd century BCE that was in response to the increasing oppression of the Seleucid monarchical rule against the practice of the Jewish religion. Specifically, Antiochus IV, after engaging with Ptolemaic Egypt on a march back through Jerusalem, has another skirmish with another Greek ruler after thinking that they were dead, and it resulted in the Second Temple at Jerusalem being turned into a syncretic Greek-Jewish temple. And suddenly laws were changed. Now there were two sets of laws for the citizens, one for those that were Greek and one for those that were Jewish, resulting in the Jews being forced to work on the Sabbath, forced to eat pork, and to cease circumcisions. And all of these offenses were punishable under the law. Okay, that was enough of the history lesson. I just want y'all to know I did a little bit of history work here. I didn't mean to bore you. But I dare say that implied in the connotation behind "in the days of King Herod," that there is something to be said about that. And here it is, Zechariah, serving God in the same temple that had once been polluted in the eyes of Jewish worshipers by the now defunct Greek Empire. Here Zechariah is here in the Roman Empire. Zechariah, whom is described as devout, one trusted to enter the Holy of Holies, enters the temple and actually sees an archangel. And what is his response? He is afraid. Now, conventional wisdom around the Christmas narratives always focus on the appearance of angels and humanity being afraid. Most times, literary critique lets us know that in the minds of the ancients, angels were scary creatures. They were scary creatures with multiple faces, multiple wings, multiple eyes. So if one just decided to show up right here, would we not all just be, "And they were sore afraid"? You know, I get it. But in the times that we're in, and in the times of our characters, Zechariah, the three shepherds watching their flock by night, and even Mary, why wouldn't those who are weary be afraid when something supernatural arrives? This Lucan writer implies that their gospel, the Gospel of Luke, is an attempt to correct the narrative and give an eyewitness account. Now, while some scholars suggest that this was only a follower of Luke, and not the actual Luke, when I read this morning's text, the only eyewitness account we have is not that of the narrator, but that of Zechariah. Think about it. The narrator was not in the inner chamber with the incense. The narrator was not the one who saw the angel Gabriel. The narrator was not the one who was struck voiceless. At best, the narrator had heard this story a few times and decided to write their own account. I mean, think about it. How many books do we have on Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, or even Donald Trump? So while the Lucan writer may be an unreliable narrator, this morning I want to talk to you and suggest that if the Lucan writer is an unreliable narrator, then that makes Zechariah an unreliable witness. What makes him an unreliable witness? I don't think he's an unreliable witness for any of the reasons William Riggins suggests for an unreliable narrator. No, I actually think it's a lot more simple than that. I posit that Zechariah is an unreliable witness because of his fear, because he is afraid. And from that, I think this text illuminates three salient points worth consideration. First, Zechariah's story lets us know that first, sometimes we encounter fear when our faith has been manifested. Gabriel's response to Zechariah's shock and fear is, when Zechariah saw him, he was terrified and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard." The inference is that Zechariah and Elizabeth had been praying for a child, and that your prayer for your child has now been heard, but I think that might be a misreading. Remember, what does the first line say? In the days of King Herod. So I ask the question, why would two elders past childbearing age pray for a child? Maybe they did. I wasn't there, but it doesn't quite make all of the logical sense for me. I would then suggest it was much more likely that they were praying for deliverance, that they were praying for salvation, they were praying for liberation from oppression. And now the child that has been promised to them was going to be the catalyst for that change. Secondly, this text teaches us, even with the manifestation of an answered prayer, we can still have doubts. Zechariah asks humbly, he asks plainly, boldly even, "How can I know that this will happen? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." And I think it's here in this exchange that exposes most directly why Zechariah is an unreliable witness. There's something about living under the threat of imminent demise that messes with your psyche. We know that living under constant stress actually alters your brain chemistry, given that your cortisol levels are always running high, your blood pressure is elevated. Zechariah and his wife, like all of the other Jews, were living under the ever-watchful eye of the Roman-backed Sanhedrin. And the last major revolt had eventually been squelched. The prospect of freedom seemed elusive. So why would Zechariah's prayers be any different than that of the prayers of his ancestors that still resulted in them being under oppression of one form or another? The immiseration by a governmental structure that does not have your well-being in mind can make you an unreliable witness. African Americans in this country had for decades been testifying about the institutional racism in the years following the civil rights era. Even with the beating of Rodney King, seen by every American with a television in 1991, it took almost 30 years before this nation could at least acknowledge that we have a problem with policing. And all in between, African Americans who spoke up about this were seen as unreliable witnesses. We turn deaf ears to the cries and wails of First Nation peoples who tell us of the dangers of fracking on indigenous and sacred lands. Why? Because of eminent domain and the almighty dollar reign supreme. Women, a whole half of the human population, are dismissed as unreliable witnesses when they tell their stories of sexual abuse, assault, and harassment. Living a life where you're constantly second-guessing your thoughts, words, and behaviors can make you an unreliable witness. You find yourself saying, what did they mean when they said that? Did I respond the right way? Was my tone too much in the email? Why didn't they sit next to me on the train? Why did they bump into me? Did they not see me? Why didn't I get the job? Was my resume not strong enough? And that's just a snippet of the spiraling effect of intrusive thoughts that can impress themselves upon people and upon those who are living under the thumb of a system that prefers death over life and despair over hope. In the century or so since the Maccabean revolt until the life of Zechariah and Elizabeth, not much had changed. The prayers that their parents prayed and their parents' parents prayed had not ameliorated the situation by any noticeable difference. Sure, the status quo had finally returned and had been settled, and Herod was not out to get them the way Antiochus IV was. But still, why would Zechariah not have doubt in this moment? Irrespective of any old regular angel, let alone the angel of the Lord showing up saying that they would have a child, is simply worthy of the question of how. And without getting too graphic, presumably Zechariah and Elizabeth had to get together and do what two humans in ancient times would do to have a baby. And I think thirdly, that this text teaches us that in Zechariah being made mute, that means that he was unable to bear witness. I dare say when you are called to provide your testimony, you do so with your voice. The thoughts of the mind are made public, they are made known, and given the breadth of possibility when you speak. Those who don't speak up often have their stories dismissed and discounted, which makes them an unreliable witness. Zechariah's silence ought to remind us of how oppressed people are rendered silent in the face of dire circumstances. Their voices are ripped from them, and the last thing that they had agency over is taken away from them. That is to say, in being made silent, he was unable to bear witness. And maybe it was just a simple fact. Maybe the angel's ego was too big and didn't like being questioned and said, "Ha, I'll fix you." But I digress. While I'll leave the story of John's birth for the preacher next week, the miraculous wonder of this week's beginning Advent story is that Zechariah's community swarmed around him. They put two and two together and figured out that he had had an encounter with God. Zechariah had given them every reason to view him as an unreliable witness as he comes out of the sanctuary and is silent and simply just making signs and hand gestures. But they realized that he had had a vision, and they believed him in his silence. How wonderful is it that in times of weariness and despair that the community of believers can still come together. And the text says that Zechariah remained at the temple until his time of service had been completed, which means that even though he couldn't talk and he could only communicate using hand gestures, no one set him down, no one sent him out to pasture, nobody shunned him, no one talked about him, and he was still doing what he had been tasked to do. The community nor the priests did not make him go home early, but still kept him within their circle of trust. Friends, while most of us don't live with the big sword of Damocles over our heads like Zechariah and Elizabeth did, we still live in uncertain times. The capricious whims of the Supreme Court are a stark reminder that we are subjected to the principalities and powers that don't always have our best interest at heart. We are getting the push notifications of news alerts on our phone about people who live in states where reproductive rights are being taken away. And even most recently, in the last week, there was a Florida legislator that introduced a bill to preemptively prevent the state of Florida from ever giving reparations to African Americans for slavery. We know that there are still millions of people that don't have health care coverage, or at least have the access that they need, and African Americans are still disproportionately more likely to have a violent encounter with police, and women are still not believed when they tell their story. Trans folks are suffering under draconian laws passed in certain states. The Lucan writer, sure, may be an unreliable narrator, but it's clear. This gospel wasn't written to get all of the details exactly right, or to make the factual claim whether this happened or that happened, or whether this didn't happen or that didn't happen, but rather to encourage the faith. Let me tell you what happened, and let me tell you why this is important. Zechariah is an unreliable witness because he was an eyewitness to a God moment that shifted the trajectory of his life and arguably even the course of human history, because 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it. The laws of science dictate that everything that happened to Zechariah is simply impossible. Thus, his eyewitness account is to not be believed. But we know better. In verse 23, the narrator records that when Zechariah's time of service had finished, he returned home. The details about how much longer he stayed in Jerusalem at the temple are scarce, but I can't help but wonder what was going through Zechariah's head as he was trying to make sense of Gabriel's promise and couldn't talk it out. Gabriel's promise is that you will have joy and gladness. I can't help but wonder what the other temple workers were thinking, knowing that Zechariah had a vision, but he couldn't communicate it. Now, maybe you could ask, why didn't he write it down in the sand? Why didn't he grab some chalk and write it on the wall? Perhaps, though, it was like fire shut up in Jeremiah's bones. Perhaps this was something welling up like an undignified dance that David did, which resulted in this cognitive dissonance. The ecstasy of an eternal promise given by God often exists concurrently with the external curses by a government. This cognitive dissonance is what can make one silent. But in the silence, Zechariah holds on to the good news. You will have joy and gladness. Restoration is coming. Deliverance is coming. Salvation is coming. Liberation is coming. Beloved friends, we are the children of God, and it does not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when we see Jesus, we shall be like Jesus, for we shall see Jesus face to face. So in the bleak midwinter, when it's cold and gloomy outside, when it seems like the internal illumination is too dim, when the dark moon is swallowing the sun earlier and earlier each day, when the night seems to unfurl itself over everything you see, when unreliable witnesses remain silent as the price paid for survival in a mean, cruel world, Gabriel's message to Zechariah is the same message that rings forth today. You will have joy and gladness, for the Messiah, the Christ child, is coming. For the scriptures tell us, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked places shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. And the glory of God shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of God has spoken it. Hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Most High, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching for God's understanding. God gives power to the faint, and to them that have no might, God increases their strength. Even the youth shall faint and grow weary, and the young shall utterly fall, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Friends, beloved, hold fast, hold on. Joy and gladness is on the way.